The first step in preparing for this dog food recipe is to have saved up some eggshells from eggs that you had previously used. And you want your eggshells to be dried. You don't want any wet, goopy egg in there to cause clumping. And what we're going to do is we're going to grind up these eggshells into a powder, and that's going to be added to your homemade dog food recipe as a calcium supplement. And there's some debate about whether or not you should bake them or treat them otherwise for bacteria or anything of that nature, but I personally don't do that. I just dry them out, put them back in the carton and let them sit out. And then I like to use this Cuisinart spice and nut grinder, but you can use any kind of seed grinder. Some people use food processors, but I find that this works very well because the blade sits really low, and it does a much better job than the food processor at getting all of the eggs. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to crush the egg in my hand into the grinder. And I'm going to put a few of these eggs in here. And what I like to do is make large batches of the shells, and then I save them in an airtight jar. So now I've got my shells in here, and I'm going to put my lid on, and when I press down on this, it's going to grind up my shells. And something to note is that when you do this, you get a lot of fine powder floating in the air inside of this container, which will come out and you'll breathe it in. So I like to sort of let it set for a second, and then when I take this off, you'll probably see it coming out. So you could also do this near an exhaust vent, maybe on your stove or something like that, or you could have your windows open so you're not breathing that in. And this little cup comes off, but hopefully you can see there that we've got some nice eggshell powder in there. And so then what I'll do, see, I have some here from before. This is just a regular canning jar, so then I'll pour this into my jar so I can use my servings whenever I need, and I don't have to keep making them all the time. So we're going to use this here in a minute. I start my homemade dog food recipe with 8 chicken breasts, boneless, that I got from the butcher at the grocery store. And I put a piece of foil in my pan, which makes the cleanup easier later. And I bake these chicken breasts at 420 degrees Fahrenheit for approximately 20 to 30 minutes until the internal temperature of the thickest piece in the center of the pan is at least 165 degrees Fahrenheit. This is going to ensure that you have killed any potential bacteria that might be lingering in your chicken. Now, there's some debate about whether or not it's safe to give dogs raw meat. And you may initially think, well, wild dogs eat raw meat, why not? And I thought the same thing myself, but when I started to feed a raw diet, my immediate concerns were my own interactions with my dog after he has eaten this raw meat. Dogs like to lick your hands and your face, and you have to think, if you're feeding them raw chicken, then the concern is contamination for them and contamination transferring to you or your children. And that, I think, was the deciding factor of why I decided to start cooking my chicken. But anyway, so I've got my chicken here cooked already. And what I'm going to do is cut it into manageable pieces that I can put into the food processor. And you can use any food processor, but I use a Hamilton Beach food processor. It works very well. And you can't put whole, well, these are halves, but you can't put the entire half into the food processor at once, or it's going to have a really hard time chopping it all up. So I cut it into smaller pieces. This one in particular calls for approximately 2-inch pieces when you're doing whole meats. And I don't put all 8 pieces in there at once either. Reason being, I find that I end up with chunks of chicken in here that aren't getting processed, and I have to sort of dig them out and try to work them in so that they'll get blended as well. So I've got a few pieces in here now. And now I'm going to chop this up on low until it's shredded. We don't want to turn it into a paste. That doesn't take long at all. And then I'm going to take this chicken and put it into a big mixing bowl. And I'm going to do that for all of these pieces. I find that meat shears do a really good job of cutting up this meat really quickly without me having to get out a cutting board and a knife and then having to clean up the cutting board later. Same thing, we're going to shred this now. Normally this sticks to the counter, but I need to clean the little suction cups. So this is the problem I was talking about earlier. I added a little more chicken than usual, and so I've got this chunk in here that's not getting blended well. So I'm going to try to mix this up a little bit and try to get that blended. You don't want to have any large chunks, especially if you're transitioning from processed commercial food, the pasty stuff, to this, because when you go from one consistency to another, it can be hard for them to digest. And I am actually making a very large batch right now because I like to save myself time by freezing large batches for later. You know, some people are concerned that this will take too much time, and so that's why they don't do this. They prefer to make something that's already been made for them. But when you do this in large batches, it's really not that time consuming. It's like adding one extra meal for yourself. You know, one extra meal of cook time, which really isn't that bad. So. Now, if you are transitioning from a pasty type of commercial dog food, you can turn this into a paste, and that might actually be recommended that you turn this into a paste to start out with, because it will be easier for their stomachs to digest. And then over time, gradually, you can start making it more of a shredded consistency. Unfortunately, dogs have really sensitive stomachs, and a lot of change can upset their stomachs. So I've got this giant bowl of shredded chicken. So I'm going to set that aside. Now I've got some frozen blueberries, and I like to buy my vegetables and fruits for the dog recipes frozen because they last much longer. And so I'm just going to put some of this blueberry into the processor, and I try to do a 10 to 20% ratio of fruits and vegetables to protein or meat. You want to make sure your protein consists of meat and not some substitute, because dogs process meat protein differently than like soy protein and things of that nature. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a little bit of water to this. I added some frozen green peas, and that's going to help add vitamins and minerals to the meal. And I choose blueberries a lot because they provide nutrients that help the brain cells reproduce better. There's a lot of good information on that on the internet. So I'm going to add a little bit of water. I don't measure anything. I just kind of eyeball it. And what we're going to do is kind of make a puree. My dog doesn't particularly like whole peas or berries, and will just spit them back out on the floor. So I make a puree, and then we'll mix that with the chicken, and then he ends up eating it. Sometimes you may need to add a little more water, or you might need to mix this up with a spoon or something to make sure that it all gets blended well. Okay, and now I'm going to add, and you really can add this at any point in time during the process, but I'm going to add some eggshells that we made earlier. eggshell powder, and that's going to help add a natural source of calcium. And again, I don't measure, I just put a little bit in there. I don't overdo it. And then I'll just mix this up some more. Okay. Now we're going to take this puree, and you can substitute other fruits and vegetables if you like. I do recommend that you change it up every now and then, but you should really only change maybe 1 or 2 ingredients at a time, because again, their stomachs are sensitive, and sometimes even subtle changes can upset them. And you also need to make sure that your dog is okay with certain things, because they're sensitive just like people, and some things just might not agree with their stomachs. Now, I started out with small batches of this to make sure that he could tolerate it. So I'm going to mix in the puree. And then I'm going to take the leftover juice and little bits of fat from this pan, and I'm going to add this to the bowl as well. You'll see that there's some debate about whether or not to include fats and oils, and to avoid fatty types of meat and things like that. But dogs, especially active dogs, burn a lot more calories than we do, and they need higher fat content than we do. Now, I'm not saying that you should go buy fatty meat, because I don't think that's a good idea. But when you buy meat that's lean already, you don't want to strip it further of its natural juices and oils, because that's going to be good for the dogs and provide energy for them. So, let me just take this off here. You can use some sort of utensil to mix this, but I prefer to use my hands, because it's such a large mixture that trying to use a utensil is just really difficult and a slow process. Now, of course, I washed my hands before I started, so I'm just kind of kneading this and mixing it all up, making sure that the puree is blended well with the chicken, and also making sure I don't have any huge chunks, which I just found a big chunk in here. Try to just break it up with my hands. If you find big chunks, you can try to break it up with your hands, or just put it back in the food processor. And be prepared that if you're using frozen fruits and vegetables, it can be really cold. This is pretty cold, but the chicken helps warm it up. You might need to let it sit for a minute. if it's too full for you. So I just want to make sure that everything is blended together real well and that I don't have any large concentrations of the fruits and vegetables, because the dogs don't particularly like that by itself. Alright, so as you can see, I've got this nice shredded meat mixture, and the dogs absolutely love it. And I'm providing not only the nutrients and protein from the meat, but I'm also giving additional minerals and nutrients from vegetables and fruit, and added calcium from the eggshells. So what I'll do now is I'll put a portion of this into a airtight container for immediate serving, and serving over the next up to a week. You don't really want to save it any longer than that. And then the rest of it I'll put into individual containers of the same size, so that I can unthaw individual containers that will last me for up to a week each time. And this makes it really easy and convenient and time saving. And I want to add that if you're going from commercial dog food or some other recipe you've been using to a new recipe like this, just be warned that your dog's stomach can become upset initially. That's because it's sort of a shock to their system. It's not that there's anything wrong with the food, it's just that they need time to adjust. And if they're having a really hard time, it might be a good idea to start out by mixing in part of the new food with some of the old food, and kind of gradually weaning them off of the old food. But otherwise, it's not killing your dog or anything of that nature. It's just that some take longer to adjust than others. And that's it for this recipe. Thanks, guys.